Hello and welcome to the second part of this CDN series. In this part of the video, I would be talking about setting up an Azure endpoint. For people who don't really understand how CDN works, it would be beneficial if you could watch the first part of this video series. You'll get a common understanding of basic CDN principles. For people who are at an advanced level, they can follow along. The aim of this part of the video is to make sure that it's more demo oriented. So I'm going to be walking through the basic concepts of creating an Azure CDN endpoint and it should cover the most common scenarios when you try to set up a CDN endpoint. I've left the edge cases out at this point in time. So if you guys want to follow along and try setting up your own CDN endpoint while I do the demo, that would be really handy for the learning experience. So having said that, let's jump on to what Azure CDN is all about, right? So inside of Azure CDN, you'll find that there are actually four different products. There is a standard Azure CDN, there is an Akamai CDN, and there are two Verizon CDNs as well, one standard and one premium. Azure actually provides a layer, a standard interface on top of the other three, the Akamai and the Verizon CDNs, and basically gives us a standard interface where we can set up all of these CDN products using basically the same set of tools and interfaces. So basically, the major differences amongst all of these two, as you could well imagine, is the number of POPs or the points of presence, which I spoke about in my last video. Microsoft standard Azure CDN seems to have a lot more point of presence across the globe, as you would imagine, being a massive company having a very large, set of infrastructure. It can cater to needs where you've got a massive global audience. But then there are other attributes that you can look at, such as dynamic acceleration mechanism. I wouldn't actually go into details in all the features of each specific CDN, because dynamic acceleration mechanism could itself take a whole set of video series. It basically just allows dynamic websites to handle the caching part much better, right? So I'm not going to really touch upon them in any more detail than this, right? So let's having said that, let's jump to our Azure portal and try setting up a CDN endpoint from scratch. Now, for the purposes of this Azure tutorial, I've actually set up a blob storage which has one image hosted on the blob storage, just to show that blob storage can actually be accessed via a CDN, right? So this is what I've got in my blob storage, just a single image. As you would probably notice in this URL, it's basically the Azure blob, and then I've got a folder in that blob and then an image in the blob, right? So this is just for the purpose of the demo. I'll just show you how you can actually use other base storages to under your CDN basically. So let's go back to our Azure portal. To set up a CDN, first you need to create a CDN profile. You search for a CDN in Azure portal. The first result that you should get is the Microsoft CDN, and this is the one that we would be using. So if you go into here, it'll give you a brief description. You do, press create, and then you get shown the screen. It's pretty self-explanatory. So I'll start typing in my demo CDN. I'm using a free trial for the demo. I've already set up a resource group, so I can use a resource group that I'm showing here, and then I've got my resource group location, which is because if I was creating a new resource group, this location would be enabled. Now, if I click on the pricing tier, you will notice that I've got 4 different options. As I said in my slides, these are the 4 products that are offered via the Azure CDN. For the purposes of this demo, we'll keep it really simple. We'll choose the standard Microsoft one. The other ones provide some additional capabilities, but for most part of your CDN, if you want the really basic vanilla functionality, a standard Microsoft one is probably the best option. But again, it's on a case by case basis, right? All right, so we've got an option of creating a CDN endpoint directly here, but I'm not going to click this checkbox. I'll actually show you how to create a CDN endpoint once we've got this CDN profile provisioned. So it generally takes some time to set this up. So as you would notice, it's now going, the portal is going back and just trying to set up my CDN profile. While we wait for this to set up, I'll actually jump into my storage account to give you an idea of how I've actually set up my storage account for all of this, right? So as I said, I've got a conventional storage account, and I'm not really using file shares, tables, or queues in a container. You can just go in, and I've just created a container using this option here, plus container. Inside of the container, I could have uploaded anything. I've just decided to upload this blob storage image .png that you can see using this upload option, right? So this is just a basic setup just for the purposes of this demo. Your live environment would probably have things that might be more complicated. I generally try to use storage accounts for my static assets or static JS files or CSS files, etc. So now we can see that I've got a CDN profile created. So I'm going to go into my demo CDN profile, and I'll notice that I've got a host of options there. Again, I'm not going to talk about every one of these options, but as you can see, I've got this section which identifies that I've got no endpoint set up at this point in time. So each of your JS, CSS, image that you want needs to have a separate endpoint, and that may not be true if you're actually caching the whole folder, right? That way you don't really have to provide any specific URL. So let's go about creating an endpoint first, right? So this is my first endpoint. What I'm trying to do is trying to point this CDN endpoint into the blob storage image that I just showed you earlier, right? So let's give it a name, my CDN endpoint. Hopefully this name is available. It's not. I'll just give it 2019. Hopefully no one's used that. And yes, that's available, right? Now if you look at the origin type, I've got a couple of 4 options in there. Again, as I said, I'll be using the storage blob. So but there are other options. You could use cloud service. The classic cloud service can be used if you're set up if you're using PaaS mechanisms and you've set up a web app, and the web app has a static components such as again your CSS images and your JS files. You can use this option, or you can have a totally custom option. Let's say you've got something deployed on premise, or you're hosting something on the GoDaddy servers, for example. You can just use your custom origin and provide the details. Again, for this demo, I'll be using storage. So when I select the storage account, the origin host name becomes active. And if I click on this, you'll be able to see my storage account. Again, in this particular tenant, I've got just one storage account. So I'm just going to select this storage account. And then it will just populate the host header by itself. You don't need to change this, keep it as a default. Right now, this origin path is interesting, right? If I go back to my blob storage, the structure of this blob storage, as you can see, has a folder, this folder name, container demo, and then it has a blob storage image.png, right? Now what I want to do is copy this container demo, that folder name. I'll copy it and I'll place it in the path here, right? So basically what it's saying is my origin host, go to my origin host name, right? Go to the origin path, right? And then it will try to fetch whatever I ask it to fetch, right? So this is just just creating an endpoint. I can now select a protocol here. So let's say you don't want your image to be accessed via HTTP. You can just switch off this option and just keep the HTTPS option. If you select HTTPS option, obviously you've got to worry about SSL certificates, and that's again a totally different story. So again, for the purposes of all of this, I'll just keep both of them selected. Now this third option, this final option, is actually a very interesting one. Depending on what type of CDN product you've used for Azure, this drop down would populate with a host of options. With the Microsoft standard one, you've got only one option, general web delivery. And again, as I said earlier, this is going to work for most of your use cases. It will allow you to cache image files, JS files, CSS files. It can be used for video streaming. It can be used for large blobs. So again, most of the use cases are covered via this general web delivery. So I'll leave it as it is and not do anything. Now, right at the bottom of the screen, you've got an add button, right? So I'll click add now, and now we'll wait for our endpoint to be provisioned. So one of the things that you've got to keep in mind is that there is a definite propagation time. So once you create a CDN, it may or may not be available immediately. In fact, Microsoft sites indicate specific times, and I believe off the top of my head, the Microsoft standard one has a delay of around 10 minutes, and the HMI one has a delay of around a minute. So keep that in mind when you're actually provisioning endpoints on the fly. If your website actually relies on these endpoints to be created immediately, and you're expecting that your website would load up while you're actually pointing to your CDN endpoints for your CSS or image files, you might be in for a surprise because they might not load, they might take some time. So you might want to just have some stopgap arrangements, maybe just create an automated process at the back end that pushes all of this, all of your assets behind the scenes first before you actually upload your website. So if you look at this this message from Azure, it says exactly the same thing. It can take up to 10 minutes for my demo CDN endpoint settings to reach every CDN pop. But because we do not really have any patience, again, I'll just jump into this and I'll copy the CDN endpoint URL. Now the CDN endpoint, so as you can see, this actually indicates the origin hostname, and this is the endpoint hostname. This is my CDN endpoint. Now it completely hides away my origin hostname, right? So I can just use this directly. So I'll just copy this, and I will go into my browser window, open up a new one, and I'll copy this, right? Now this is pointing to my container storage. If I go back to my original image, you'll notice that I've got my blob storage URL and my container URL, and then my image name, right? That CDN endpoint is a combination of my blob storage plus my container name. So all I need to do is copy this image name and append it to my endpoint, right? I'll just remove the extra / and then I'll do this. And as you can see, this is actually now pulling that data from the CDN. So it doesn't actually, show anything to do with the underlying blob storage. So let's go back to our endpoint again. As you can see, too many options here. What you can do is have a look at all of these options. Again, I'm not going to talk about all of these in detail because some of the options are standard across most of the resources in Azure. So stuff like custom domains, right? Whenever you create a web app or anything, you need to set up a custom domain. Again, a totally separate topic. What I'm going to talk about is origins first, right? So while we were actually creating a CDN, you saw that we had a collection of origins. So I can, once I've created a CDN, I can actually update this origin to point to something else later on. And again, we have walked through all of these other attributes while creating the CDN endpoint as well. So I'll skip over the custom domains and we'll jump over to compression, right? So in order to talk about compression, let's go back to our slide deck, right? So inside of compression, what happens is the CDN basically compresses your static assets, right? They don't need to be compressed at the origin server. So you make a request to your CDN. The CDN then makes a request to your origin server. Origin server returns this massive blob of data, which the CDN then compresses and returns to the end user. Now, how does the CDN actually decide what to compress and what type of compressed data does the client accept? So the client during the initial handshake sends, or while the client actually makes the initial request, sends an encoding type to the CDN and hence the origin server as well. So using that specific request header, the CDN knows that there are certain types of compressed data that the client can actually accept, and based on this information, the CDN would intelligently try to compress that data and keep it there. According to various research, it has been shown that the compression at CDN can actually reduce the size of your JavaScript files or your text files by at least 50 to 70%. So that's a massive saving that actually happens from the CDN to your client. So imagine this: the CDN is close to you in terms of your geographical location, but it also minifies the size of the packet, right? So massive savings. Your site would definitely be faster. So let's go back to our next part. So our next part is the caching rules. So sorry, before I jump on to the caching rules, you can see you've got there's a pre-configured set of things that this Azure CDN can actually compress. And unfortunately, at this point in time, I don't think you can add more stuff to it. And the only thing you can do is turn it off. By default, it's on, so everything's already set up for you. So let's jump over to the caching rules, and we'll just wait for it to come back. All right, so the caching rules warrant a bit more discussion. There are just 3 caching rules in there, but very important in how you set up your CDN strategy. So again, to actually explain all of this, I'm going to jump back to the slide deck, but just so you can note, by default, ignore query strings is selected, right? So again, your use cases, your core of your use cases are already covered with this option, but then you've got the flexibility to change it to into another strategy if you want to, right? Let's go back to our slide decks to discuss this in a bit more detail. So what happens when you try to ignore a query string, right? You make a request, right? Let's say you're requesting myurl.com and you've got a query string which indicates the version number, version equals to 1. For those who don't really know what query string is, that's the stuff after the question mark. So that's what we call a query string. So let's say I make a request to this URL. The CDN, the first time around, it makes a request to the origin server. The origin server requests responds with that data, and that data is returned to the end user, right? Now the next time you come again and you make a request to the CDN, but this time while using the same URL, you change the query string to be version 2. Now remember, you're using the ignore query string option over here, right? So what the CDN actually does, CDN already has that data cached, but it's being cached for version 1, right? But the CDN doesn't really care at this point in time. When you've got this setting, the CDN wouldn't care about what you're sending as part of the query string. It will just look at the base URL and use that base URL to respond to your data. So it will actually send you information about myurl.com version equals 1, right? So that's what happens when you ignore query strings. Again, that it all depends on your strategy. Now the second option was bypass caching for query strings. You make a request, right? What it does is basically just rips out your version altogether and sends it to the origin server. The origin server responds, and then you get a response from myurl.com. So it doesn't bother about the query string at all, right? So that's your second option. For the third option, I'm going to go back here, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It's cache every unique URL. So if you've got myurl.com version 1, myurl.com version 2, and version 3, it will have 3 different entries in the CDN, and it will respond to all these 3 requests differently. So yeah, again, it depends on what you really are after in terms of your CDN. Right, so that covers our caching rules. For geofiltering, now this is where we talk about if you want to control where you can actually, where can the CDN actually operate, which geographical locations you may want to turn off, right? If you look at the action, just do available actions, right? I want to basically say, all right, I want to block the CDN from operating in certain countries. I don't want my data to be rendered in certain countries. I don't want my blob storage image to be shown in Antarctica, for example, right? So I'll just turn it off, and I'll select a number of countries and just hit save, and that will just stop the CDN from serving any content in those regions. So again, pretty handy if you've got a global clientele and you want, but you still want to kind of make sure that your content is not served in places you don't really want it to go. All right, so I'll just discard these changes. Let's come to optimizations and see what we've got here. Again, during the creation of this endpoint, as I said earlier, we've got just one option, general web delivery. And you can again have more options in here, and they've actually specified how you can get all of this information. As they say here, use general web delivery for your regular static content and media streaming and your large file download. So that basically would cover most of your use cases. The final thing I want to discuss is the rules engine. So I've got the rules engine is a pretty cool feature here, and it allows you to basically make changes to your intercepted requests and to your responses. Right, so how do they actually work? So if I go in, try to add a rule, I'll say, all right, my first rule. I've got an option to select a condition and an action. So it's pretty much an if-else statement using configuration. So I can say add condition that, if I've got, let's say, if my condition is that I've selected a query string. And as you can see, there are lots of options you can select from. So I say, all right, I've got a query string, and if my query string equals version equals 1, right? In that case, what happens? I'll add an action, and I'll say modify the request header. And I'll say append the request header, and what we can do is basically allow, I can't actually remember what the specific header was for allowing cores, but let's say it was allow origins, right? Now we can say if someone's actually requesting version 1 of the blob, right? regardless of wherever that request is originating from, please serve them the content, right? So it's very important to kind of manage your cores correctly, because you may not want your content to be served by third-party spam websites. So very important to control all of this. I might want to say that if again, if it's version 1, I might want my website to host this content, right? So I can change that header value. So if you notice on the left hand side, it says if query string. So if then, so if else statements over here, and then you can keep on adding conditions and actions, and this will basically modify your request, or in fact if you want to modify your response as well. So let's say in just one go, I want to modify my request and my response, then I can do both, right? So if a request comes in for a version 1 of the hosted blob on the CDN, then I'll just change that content to be served from all origins, and then I can change the response type that comes back from the CDN as well to something, right? I can add another header over here or whatever I want, so with that, I think we've covered most of the important bits and pieces of of setting up the CDN endpoint. So just to summarize, we've gone through what products the Azure CDN offers, a very high level overview of what might be different in all of these products. I've intentionally not spoken about the pricing. Generally, the pricing of the standard one would be much cheaper, but because they tend to change from time to time, it's better to have a look at the Microsoft website for the specific pricing details. Then we've touched upon all the important key factors of setting up your CDN endpoints that would again satisfy most of your use cases. In the next part of this video, I'll try to pick another CDN that we can use to set up our endpoint. I haven't decided which one yet. It might be the one on AWS or CloudFront, or so yeah, I'll decide that, and then we'll have a look at that in the next one. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave comments, and then you can follow me on Twitter, or you can have a look at my earlier videos to get a good understanding of how CDN operates. So I'll hope to see you again next time around. Best of luck. Thank you.